Good evening, and thank you for attending this unique evening presentation by Patricia Watwood on the spatial visual imagination. My name is Dan Thompson. I'm Dean of Fine Arts of Studio Incominati, School for Contemporary Realist Art here in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I want to begin by acknowledging the tremendous contributions from our underwriters, Stephen Allen Bennett and Elaine Melody-Schmidt, for underwriting this important lecture series, as I mentioned. This program centers itself on the why factor of skill acquisition. It is important to determine your voice as well as the means to speak. Let us dwell for a moment on the means of acquiring a universally proficient manner of visual communication. At Saturday's open house, I read a portion of The Art Spirit, Robert Henry's acclaimed 1923 book about art training. In it, he was asked about the purposes of an art school. He stated, quote, "That of interest in the work, through stimulating in students a more profound study of life, a real understanding of construction, proportion, drawing, stimulating activity, mental and physical, moral courage, invention and expression to fit the idea expressed, the study, therefore, of a specific technique, not a stock technique, a school where individuality of thought and individuality of expression are encouraged." Of the students in his ideal art school, he further said, quote, "Taking their work as a matter of vital importance to the world, considering their technique as a medium of utterance of their most profound philosophy of life." Henry's description increasingly resembles, to me, through this tremendous faculty and a curriculum 20 years in the making, Studio Incominati. With our application deadline quickly approaching on August 29th, I encourage all who are ready for a commitment to active learning, immersive study, and a great number of epiphanies in the life room to consider seriously this exquisite program called the Advanced Fine Arts Program, which you can find out more of at our webpage, which is new at studioincominati.edu. After having said that, I want to introduce Patty Watwood. I will be monitoring the live chat, so please submit your questions, join the conversation, and enjoy this presentation. Patricia Watwood is a leading figure in the contemporary figurative movement. Her subjects are primarily women in figures, incorporating myth and narrative. She has been exhibited at the Beijing World Art Museum, the European Museum of Modern Art, also called Ming, the Butler Museum, and is in the collections of the St. Louis University Museum of Art and the New Britain Museum of American Art. Her commissioned portraits hang in institutions such as the St. Louis City Hall, Washington University, the Kennedy School of Government, and at the Harvard Art Museums. Watwood is a member of the Salmagundi Club of New York, where she is the current vice president. She is also a signature member of the Portrait Society of America and named a living master at the Art Renewal Center. She is represented by Portraits Incorporated and Dacia Gallery, as well as others. Watwood earned her MFA with honors from New York Academy of Art and studied with Jacob Collins as a founding member of the Water Street Atelier. Watwood has produced instructional DVDs, including Creating Portraits from Life with Streamline Art Video, and has been a professor of drawing at the New York Academy of Art. She has created several online drawing courses, including 7 Days of Drawing with the creative streaming platform craftsy.com. She has written articles for American Artist Magazine, American Arts Quarterly, Fine Art Connoisseur magazine, and teaches painting in Brooklyn online with terracotta.org and in workshops across the country. Her first book, The Path of Drawing, is coming out with Monticelli Studio Press in late 2022. Find her on Instagram at Patricia Watwood and also on Facebook at patricia.watwoodstudio. Please welcome Patricia Watwood.
Thanks so much, Dan. Thank you very much, Dan. It's a real honor to be here. It's nice to meet all of you here at Studio Incominati. Dan and I go way back from when we were students together at New York Academy of Art and at Water Street with Jacob Collins. And it's just a real pleasure to see who one of the people I think is one of the great teachers of our age has come so far and now leading this school, and I'm so proud to be here. And I'm also just proud to be at Studio Incominati, the home of the Shanks family and Nelson Shanks, who was a really important friend and mentor to me. And so I'm just grateful to Annalisa and to Leona and glad to be here. So thank you for coming. So Dan introduced me. I think I would just also say that I grew up in the Midwest in St. Louis. I moved to New York to study painting, to study with Jacob Collins, and to go to New York Academy of Art. And I still live in New York. I live in Brooklyn. I have a husband. I have two almost grown kids. And I do a lot of portraiture. So I'm going to show you this talk tonight. I'm going to show you some things about my work. But then I'm going to spend a fair amount of time talking about picture building, world making. So my talk it's going to jump around a little bit. So I'm going to introduce some of, just give you an overview of the kinds of work that I do, including this painting, which I did for Harvard for the Kennedy School of Government of Ida B. Wells. This has been one of my favorite projects. I did this for the Kennedy School, for their conference center. They educate leaders for the future, and up to that time, the paintings that they had were of John Adams and Winston Churchill. And so in this moment in time, it's really important for institutions to present the women, the people of color who have made important contributions to our society and have not been appreciated. So this was a really, of all of the projects I've ever done, I felt like I was, in its own little way, made a difference in the world, and it was a great project to do. And then my personal claim to fame, bragging rights, is that they used my design for the design of the Ida B. Wells Barbie doll, which can die happy. As another portrait project that I did of a woman who was a sister and a pediatrician who created a medical clinic in El Salvador during the Civil War there in the late 90s. And she was just a really unbelievably compassionate, talented person. She was actually a teacher to my sister who went to medical school in St. Louis. And so I did this posthumously for the hospital in St. Louis. So 2 posthumous portraits that I've done. I do a lot of work that is somewhere between figurative and portrait work. This is sort of a portrait, but really it's not a commissioned portrait. It's a non-commissioned portrait of a person, because I like to working in a very traditional mode in class, with classical representational tight drawing. But what are the things that we can do that really anchor your work in the present moment? So this for me was a fun portrait because of the way, on one hand, it's based on a tradition of a French academic method and traditional draftsmanship, but by virtue of who she is and her hairstyle is very specifically now. And that's kind of a theme in my work overall, is on one hand working in a mode that is academic, that is classically trained, but what are the things that show that I am making this work now and in the present moment as opposed to relating to the past. This is a painting that's actually in the Bennett collection, and I'm really appreciative of all of the support that Stephen Bennett and Elaine Schmidt have done for women artists and realists. And so there's a few other paintings of other artists that I'm showing in this presentation. They've just done tremendous support for women in the arts, and so I'm really grateful to be here. This is a painting that's in their collection called Venus Apocalypse. A lot of my work, I work with nudes, but I'm often looking at things that somehow also are related to art history. So taking a subject from art history, in this case it's like a play on Botticelli's Venus, but using that theme to have a conversation about myself as an artist in my time relative to that artist in that time. So Botticelli's Venus, the air is very fresh and clean, and the flowers are dewy, and everything is perfect and ideal in this Platonic environment. But this was done in New York City right after Hurricane Sandy, and I went out to the beach where Coney Island had been inundated and flooded and damaged. My kids' school was shut down, and I gathered a lot of stuff, detritus that was from that event. And so I'm increasingly interested in issues of environmentalism and often finding ways to represent or use symbols of the fragility of our environment in relationship to the human presence. So it's taking this theme of Venus, like from the Renaissance, but then updating it in terms of a very different sense of our place of humanity in time and place, and obviously now, being very much now. You know, it's Manhattan on one side, it's like Coney Island and the Wonder Wheel on the other side. So there's sometimes ideas about whether it's industrialization, amusing ourselves to death, commerce, right? What are the things that you can kind of subtly symbolize and allude to in the environment of the painting, and then using the nude as a way to talk about maybe humanity's place in it, maybe my own emotional relationship to it. So this is one of my paintings in that theme. This one is another kind of the same theme. It's not, this is a more recent painting, and so it's not using as much finely detailed realism in the symbolism around him. Increasingly in recent years, I am more interested in how to use abstraction and painterly touches and things that are not very literal in their description to evoke a concept as opposed to literally describing it. So in this painting, maybe you guys know it's a painting by Hippolyte Flandrin, famous 19th century painting of, and he was interested in sort of the Platonic ideal and a particular shape of the body. But again, it was sort of evoking like a golden age, right? That this beautiful nude is in this golden era atmosphere. And I was working with this model who actually kind of made this pose, and I was like, all right, now I have to paint this pose. But then the way I've created the setting around him is much more like it's on the verge of destruction. Although it was fun to do this because it was actually a lot of times with the foreground elements or the details, it's actually very intuitive. Like I kind of have a vague idea of a shape that I want to evoke, but I don't want to literally describe it. I don't want to actually have to paint a Corinthian column with detail. I want to evoke it through the texture and shapes of the paint. And so then it's a fun game for me as a painter to try to see how to, whether it's almost like a Rorschach, like seeing into an image something that it evokes without literally being that. So I'm very increasingly interested in using more abstraction and evocative suggestion of the subject and as opposed to a literal one. So that's kind of just an overview of my work. And so now I'm going to change gears a little bit and talk about what I wanted to talk about in the theme of this talk, which is the spatial visual imagination. This is sort of my own language, that term, the spatial visual imagination. In the lives of the artist Vasari, in the Italian Renaissance, they talked about the importance of disegno. And disegno is kind of a catch-all phrase terming to composition, the artist's design, the drawing. It's kind of but it sort of meant many things. But one of the things that I think that is essential about the concept of disegno at that time, which is very different from making paintings more in like 20th century, is this principle of the conceptualization and the creation of imaginative space, and that it was pictorial space, and that it was constructed imaginative space, which is very different from what became the practice, which I'm going to try to articulate through this talk, in the 19th and then 20th century of painting maybe observed space, perceptual space, right? But they really moved away from this idea of imaginative space. And I'm increasingly interested in this, and that's what I want to kind of dig into in this talk. This is actually a contemporary abstract drawing by Tom Mazzullo, and it was actually done in silver point. But to me, it embodies this concept of our spatial visual imagination. So you as artists, or anyone watching this, can you visualize in your mind a sphere? Okay, it's pretty easy. Can you visualize in your mind a sphere with meridian lines on it? Can you visualize the meridian lines like a globe without the sphere, right? So these are acts of the spatial visual imagination. And I think that that is one of the things that we as artists want to be able to build, that hopefully as very visual people, that we have a natural capacity for that. If you're a visual thinker, are you good at reading maps? Are you good at not getting lost in the woods? Are you good at driving around a city and knowing how to get, all of those are like acts of your mind, of your mental capacity to visualize space and shape and volume in 3 dimensions in your mind. And I think that this is this really essential skill. And one of the things I want to talk about in this talk is how things that I have done in my life that I think have helped me learn that, and a few things that I think that artists should focus on if you want to be able to do that in our own work. So I just like this drawing because it sort of represents, right? It's a 3-dimensional imaginative space, but it's also just very simply a piece of paper with lines. So this, I feel like, is a great masterpiece of the concept of disegno and of imaginative construction. It combines, so we are in a school for realist art, right? And we have many been trained in realism in the act of perception, observation, naturalism. So that's realism, but that is different from representation. And representation is the skill of taking identifiable objects, a face, a ball, a sphere, and using that as a common language with your audience to have a conversation about a story you want to tell. So we look at this Peter Paul Rubens, and it's a magnificent representational painting, and it sort of tricks you into thinking it's realist, but it is not. This is not realism. It's construction, and it's invention. And of course, he has amazing fidelity to drawing a dog's paw, or the wolf's teeth, or the modeled details of the horse, right? None of this ever existed in front of him in one place and in one time. It's completely an invention, right? And so Disegno, I think for the Renaissance, was understanding that that invention, that spatial visual imagination, that ability to construct and invent and take maybe the fur of a wolf that you have in your studio and prop it up with tape and glue and pins and somehow make it into a wolf, right? So this is like what I think of as the spatial visual imagination. So I'm going to change gears a little bit, and one of the things I'm actually going to talk about is my own background. And I have come to appreciate in recent years, as I've been thinking about this, how useful this background was to me. I actually started before I never thought about being a painter. I didn't major in art, I kind of minored in art. But I was in theater, and I did scenic design. So this is actually a scenic design that I did when I was in college. I was still actually acting at this time too, so that's actually me sitting on the red beanbag chair. So I was deeply immersed in the world of theater design. And I've come to appreciate over time just how useful those concepts and skills that I built in theater design are to this idea of construction, image construction, and spatial visual imagination. Here is another image of the same set. I'll just to tell you a little bit more. This particular set that I designed, on one hand, had elements of realism and also elements of symbolism and abstraction, because instead of wallpaper, what I had done is taken basically all of these kind of famous images from the newspaper, you know, of all of this was a play about conflict in the 60s and these young students who were like doing protest and radical activism. So we used all of these images to set this environment of sort of what was happening at that time, and like use those as wallpaper on the wall. So in retrospect, I realized that even in theater, in a totally different form, I was very interested in this sort of tension between, on one hand, things that were realistic and naturalistic, and on the other hand, things that were falling into abstraction or conceptualization. Also just lighting design, right? Learning, so light, you know, I was not the lighting designer for this, but lighting is a really key element to shaping elements of design in theater. And so the other thing that was really formative in my experience as a painter now is that so one of the things that I did for 4 years in college and then for 3 years after that when I was still working in theater is I did a great deal of work as a scenic painter. And when I worked in the scene shop, there was a huge rack where they would have 5-gallon buckets of pigment. So right in the art studio, you get those little like jars and you're like, wow, I got the little like cobalt teal. As a 5-gallon bucket of chrome oxide green, right? Or a 5-gallon bucket of like ultramarine blue or burnt sienna. And you would put it into another 5-gallon bucket with polyvinyl acrylic or really white glue. You would mix it with a paddle mixer on a drill, right? And you would just be, and yeah, you just mixed, okay, you need green, you're gonna get some chromium oxide green, you're gonna neutralize it with some yellow ochre, you're gonna add some gray, you know, and you're gonna custom mix those colors, and you learn early on that like ultramarine blue doesn't dissolve very well into the liquid, and it kind of clumps and it doesn't behave itself, and you learned that like raw umber pigment like dries really quickly and is cheap, and so all of this work as a scenic painter really was like deep experience in terms of what pigments do and how to mix paint and what is a binder and how do you, all of those things. And then the other thing is, so painters learn to paint with long sticks. And so we would take our 1-inch or 2-inch wide brushes and you put them into a piece of bamboo, and the bamboo would be like this long. And so then you put it into and you tape it together so that you now have a 4-foot-long paintbrush. And so you walk around on the drop on the floor and you're painting with a paintbrush. And so of course that's dexterously, like you learn skills just like how, you know, how to work with your brush. But one of the most important things you learn in that context is that it doesn't matter what it looks like from 2 feet away. It matters what it looks like from 30 feet away. And how does something read? And this issue of readability, right? Like what, and this is something that I think that actually in realism and in contemporary like narrative painting is something that we don't actually do enough of, is thinking about how our paintings read from a distance at different scales, and learning theater design and learning like scenic painting in that way. It really emphasizes the way something that looks amazing from, you know, 5 feet away looks completely different from 50 feet away, and what do you have to do? The other thing is that you learn that in order for something to project, in order for something to read at a distance, or even whether it's in theater, maybe expressiveness or sound, or like there's a stage whisper, but if you're gonna have a stage whisperer from the audience, guess what? You're not gonna really whisper. Right, you learn that in order for something to read, you actually have to exaggerate it because you have to project it to the back row. And I think that that is also something in terms of that I've taken with me in terms of thinking about picture making or communication expressiveness. If you want something to read, if you want an audience to connect with it, you can't be so subtle. Other skills that I learned in theater are things like, and I'm going to talk more about this because I think it's kind of an essential skill that I think that we all could use, is how, so this is an isometric drawings, and so you have to learn how to draft. So you're going to make a set design, and then you have to have a platform and stairs and a wall, and you have to learn how to show it in the front view, in the side view, maybe in the back view, and so that you can communicate to your builder like how to make this thing. So it forces you to take something that you were just looking at in 2 dimensions and then literally rotate it and show it from all these different dimensions. So this conceptualization, like the spindle, right, just thinking, what is the cross section? Well, okay, it's a cylinder, and so then, so if you're thinking about form making, and you're thinking about, well, what is the terminator shape, and is it a sphere? Is it a cylinder? Is it a square? What's the light, what's the shadow shape gonna look like? What's the form gonna look like? Based on that isometric or that 3-dimensional visualization. Other skills in theater, lighting design, which when we study in the atelier, we often use with a pretty fixed lighting position. You, as the artist, might move around, right? Because your easel is gonna be in one spot or a different spot. But the lighting condition's pretty fixed. But one thing you really start to understand in theater is the impact, the emotional and psychological impact of these different lighting conditions. And like, with the really brooding downlight and his face is in shadow, or the backlight, it gives this sort of noirish, very dramatic, heightened drama effect. Or you think about, like, we saw the Mary Cassatt, at the museum, and it's all like pinks and delicate and right sunshine. And those are very different psychological and emotional conditions based on the lighting design, right? And so lighting design is also a really significant element to use in terms of pictorial construction, in terms of what is the psychological content of this condition or that condition. This color light, that color light. Is it daylight, soft light, moonlight, etc. So these are all just from some of my school textbooks. Now this kind of serendipitously came to me. I geeked out about this book that is in the library of the Salmagundi Club. It was published in 1604. And you can ask Alex Catlin really nicely, and you can actually hold this book and flip through the pages of this book that was printed in 1604, which is just really exciting to me. So this was Jan Vredeman de Vries, and I am not an expert in him, but the book is amazing, and it has all of these plates. So this was 1604. And for me, I see a really clear connection between Grand Manner painting of the Baroque era, and then scenic design. But this grid, this picture right here, I think in many ways is a really foundational idea for this thing of the spatial visual imagination, right? You as an individual are looking at a flat sheet of paper with nothing but black lines on white paper. But your mind is also conscious of the fact that it actually reads as a plane in space, right? So this is a visualization of what we think of as the z-axis, right? So you have 2 axes in the 2-dimensional space, the x and the y, upper right corner, lower left corner. In thinking about 3-dimensional construction, then there is the z-axis, which is always the plane going into space. And so this grid drawing just emphasizes that clarity. And I think that this kind of image for artists, for visual people, like you see it, you get it right away. And the more that you're able in your picture construction, in even just painting a portrait, even just a model on a chair, the more you're able to visualize your figure in space, your shapes in space. This is like this foundation of this spatial visual imagination. So I'm just going to show a few more of these etchings from this perspective book by Jan Vredeman de Vries, because I think that in many ways they were really influential to then painting in the Baroque and the Grand Manner era. So then if you go from this book, and then this is Titian's presentation of the Virgin at the Temple. And you can see that they're not literally the same perspectival image, but you almost have the sense that they could have taken those de Vries drawings and traced them and cut and pasted and added a Virgin and added, right? And to be honest, I think they did. I think that they would have used these perspective drawings and plates and just use them as a tracing and be like, okay, I can put the king on this level and I can, put the Virgin over here. And so this was Baroque, early Renaissance and then into the Baroque, a really important technological innovation into pictorial space and picture making. Just a really good perspective drawing showing, different objects rotating in space. So when I was talking about isometric drawing and the ability to visualize one shape moving in space the other way, I think this drawing kind of is a good way to start to visualize like how those things are moving in space, how we might use them. Then we get to the looking up at the ceiling into this imagined space up above you. And then, of course, you can, Tiepolo's paintings were basically taking that same principle of using the perspectival drawing and then adding the imagined sky. So all of these the Tiepolo, the Titian, they have huge, complex volumes of pictorial space. And they're using architecture and perspective techniques to build a construct. But then whether it's the atmosphere or the sky, what are the other things that they're doing that also help create a sense of space or atmosphere in a picture? So going back a little bit longer to theater design, I think that I want to look at a few more theater designs and models, because for me, I think it's helpful to start to imagine how, as an artist, I might mimic some of these skills to then create an image. So there was a famous family, the Bibbiena family, Galli Bibbiena family, that did Italian Baroque theater. And there was actually like a lineage of them. There was even a woman, a daughter, Maria Bibbiena, who lived to be 93, was a really creative, talented artist. Their innovations and perspective opened new dramatic possibilities, and their lavish projects cost vast sums, with a single spectacle running budgets of up to 10 million in today's dollars. So they were like the Disney of the Italian Baroque theatrical world. It was a big deal. The Bibbienas, the first one we saw was a single point perspective. This one, and this was their big technological advance, was to learn how to use two-point perspective to then rotate the image that you're looking at. This is not going to be a lecture on perspective, so I'm not going to talk about focal points and distance, but you understand, you can see that they've rotated in space two vanishing points, and it just creates this illusion of the interior of a space. This one is fantastic. Obviously, they were building on the precision of those perspective drawings we saw with those De Vries, 1604 perspective books. Like, they knew what they were doing, and they took their time with it, right, to build something like these. And an image like this would have been a painted drop at the back of the scene on the theater. And then they would have used other scenic elements to embellish this and create this illusion of tremendous, like, wow, it looks like I'm in that space. This is a model. And so when I was studying theater, this was one of the things that you had to do, was learn how to make a model of your set design. This one shows kind of the proscenium. So the proscenium is the square at the front of the scenic design space, which is very much equivalent to the picture plane, right? So if you think about putting a frame around a picture, that mimics the proscenium that goes around the outside edge of a theater space. You see in the center is basically a painted drop, right, with this seascape. You can see that there's a little boat, which is probably like a little set piece that probably, I bet it moved, they could like move the little boat along the ocean. And then the pieces on the side, some of them are flats or legs that are just flat pieces. The tree, for example, is a little flat piece that probably would have been perpendicular to the picture plane. And then the little more castle elements are more the one on the your left side is probably a set piece that had doors and windows that they could literally go in and out and have exits and entrances in. Whereas the one on the right side was more of kind of a flat piece that creates, so that all of these scenic elements help create the illusion of these buildings in space. And like you can see the platforms, it's really important in scenic design that you have multiple levels, that not everyone is just spread out on a flat stage, because then you don't have levels, you can't create dramatic angles, and also you often can't see everyone as well, because one actor is maybe behind the other actor. So creating different levels to create a composition. So I hope you can kind of imagine how connected all of this is to large-scale figurative production in terms of making a painting, right? It's often the same kinds of things, like thinking about a backdrop, some set pieces. Where are the characters going to go in space? This is a 19th century design for a scenic drop, and I think here the line between visual art and painting and etching and something that's a scenic design is really, it's almost meaningless, right? And definitely the training of the artists who are doing these theatrical pieces in the 17th, 18th, 19th century, rivaled any realist artist trained today. So this, they would have painted this with those brushes on the sticks on a huge drop and hang it at the back of the theater. When I was in school, I was in undergraduate, and I did my theater training in undergraduate, and I wanted to go to Yale. I wanted to go and study, because that's where all the big deal people went. And so Ming Lee was the head of the Yale School of Drama, and this was his set for the Long Wharf Theater. And actually thinking back to the very first slide you saw of mine, I was definitely like kind of theaters also have a tradition of like you kind of study under this person, and so their design aesthetic sort of influences maybe a school of people. So I think I was definitely very influenced by Ming Lee and thinking about, on one hand, realism, and on other things that dissolve to become less realistic. And so that was, sorry, going back. That's the set, right, in the theater. This is a model. And so this is, like the other one we saw, a lovely example of the kind of model you would make, little pieces of wood, cutting out cardboard, Bainbridge. And so in making painting later, using model making is a really helpful way to start to invent, invented spaces, solve the problem of, well, I want to make a painting in Paris, but I'm not in Paris. Like model making and using, constructing images, gathering these things. Like I think it's really we know that a lot of painters use maquettes and models. So this kind of model making, skill building is, I think, is really a helpful concept for anybody who wants to do imaginative work. So now I'm going to pivot, and I'm going to show some of my own work and talk a little bit more about just process and some of the things steps that I've taken in terms of producing a narrative piece. This one is actually also in the Bennett collection, Pandora from 2012. This is one of the earlier ones I did where I was working with this like industrial, modern, slightly dystopian landscape, but with a classical figure. The theme for this painting and for me was connected to September 11. It does have the two towers in it and a very tiny little airplane. Pandora, you all know the theme that she opens the box and all the horrors of the world emerge. And so in many ways, all the things around her represent these horrors or the things that are making our world fragile. There's industry, there's religion, there's commerce and industrialism and capitalism. There's all of the stuff around her my studio is in Gowanus in New York. And I really did start to have a habit of like just bringing these pieces of broken technology and like the circuit boards, which I'm really into because I think they're just cool looking. And I was drawn to these objects, and I did start literally bringing them in, and I would kind of set them up like a still life in the studio. So all the things in the foreground right in front of her are just still life elements. Then she is painted from life mostly. I say mostly because, so I did a life drawing with a model. I was already thinking a lot about being very specific about the pose that I wanted to express a very specific gesture. And you'll find that when you're working with a model, they often can't really do the gesture you have in mind. And so then how do you problem solve? And so, honestly, I would paint the top part of the body while the lower part of her body was in one position, and then I would paint the lower part of her body when the upper, so you have to construct. So now going back to the beginning, that you have to get to a point where you're not just looking perceptually at one thing, but you're looking at multiple things and constructing something in your own image that is different from anything you're looking at, right? Having to construct a whole out of pieces. But in other ways, relatively straightforward, like paint a figure, still life elements in the front. And then in the background it's all invented. I live in New York now. At that time, you could see out my window, like kind of going out on the roof of this building. There are a lot of places where you could see like the cityscape. And so I am often kind of using cityscape or these industrial things, and they're based on things that I've seen or observed, or I'll sometimes use photo like support to like there's some nuclear towers in the background. I'll like go online just to get the image or the shape or of details that I want. And so I definitely will add in photo reference or found references for things that I want to add in. But it is a little bit also like a set piece in that there's a painted backdrop with the cityscape behind her, and she is seated on a little propped real thing. So I hope you can imagine like how the different components of that picture were put together. I'm very interested in using symbols, and so with Pandora, the story is that the only thing left in the box is hope. So I used an eastern bluebird, which was on the endangered species list in the Northeast, but actually has made a really good recovery, is no longer on the endangered species list. So I often find ways to weave symbols that maybe are scrutable or maybe are not scrutable, but I like to think of my pictures as kind of like an onion with many layers, that the outside layer should be beautiful and visually engaging and draw you in and make you want to unpack the layers of the story, but then the more you engage with the painting, that it would reveal itself, that you would find other things. I find that interesting. So layers, and I think about this in terms of composing and just problem solving in terms of building an image, is that I often think about the figure as the primary subject and sort of the foreground element, and what are the things in the environment right around where the figure is that you can, is it a piece of drapery? Is it a broken DVD player, right? What are the things that are right in the foreground that you can paint? Then what is in the background, which sometimes is easier to think about than just thinking about a painted drop or the design in the background. And then what is in the middle ground? And how do you make the transition between the object in the foreground and the background? And the thinking about theater training, it often is that transition that's hard. If you thought about like that little boat is covering up the fact that at the bottom of the drop, there's a seam between the floor and the boat and the drop, which makes it really obvious that it's not 5 miles away. It's right there in the other side of the room, right? So what are the things how do you obscure those transitions? And then thinking about whether it's landscape composition or pictorial composition, it's often those transitions between the foreground layer, the middle layer, and the back layer, which is really where the tricky part comes, because you have to sometimes find or invent ways to make that transition, to hide the fact that it's not really 5 miles, it's really 20 feet. This one I showed earlier. I brought in a lot of those elements in the foreground into the studio. Some of it was painted from photo. The bird, the seagull was painted from a photo. The swan was painted part from a photo and part from a dead bird. So it was both using photo and construction in terms of imagination. Because even sometimes if you find a reference that sort of works, then you have to fit it into your picture, and you often have to change it a lot. So there's definitely elements of invention that go into that. Although the more I'm able to find something to work from, the easier that invention is. So even if it's like, I didn't really have a swan, I had a white chicken, right? Like, and you're like, I'll just make the wing a little longer. And like, as long as you have something to start with, it's kind of theater. It's like, you just start with something, and then you can sort of make it look like a Venetian palace. I draw. Most of my paintings begin with a process of drawing. Sometimes they start with a process of the model loving a pose and working with the model, as opposed to designing a pose. In this case, I was thinking about that Botticelli, and so I designed the pose and got the model to take the position. I had actually done some small concept sketches from imagination. This painting of the seagulls, in part I was kind of practicing thinking about how I wanted the seagulls to be in the big painting, but I also, this was just a concept sketch for the sky and the details in the foreground, done from imagination to just try different designs for like the shape of the sky, the diagonal of the clouds, the color design of it. So oftentimes thinking about like that background layer, like how do I want to design that sky? I'll maybe make a separate study just for that, just like what do I want that shape to be like? So there's a few of the concept things for that. This is this large-scale painting that I did called Orpheus playing for Persephone and Eurydice in the underworld. This painting is the biggest one I've made so far. It's 6 feet by 9 feet, so the figures are almost life-size. But I think to me, it seems very clear how connected my construction ideas are to theater, because it still sort of feels a lot to me like kind of a painted drop behind her, and then the platform that she's lying on, and yes, I like finding the right fabric. Also, another thing that I've figured out in making these is I have to cast my characters, and I have to really be very thoughtful and selective about who are the actors who are going to be that role in my painting, because oftentimes a person's face, they just don't feel right. You're like that, you're not right for that part. Like, you can't cast you in that role. And so I've definitely learned over time to be more and more particular, or like take the time in that process to really identify the person to embody the story I want to tell. This is based on the story of Orpheus and Eurydice. Eurydice is the standing figure in the white dress. She dies. Orpheus and Eurydice are deeply in love. She dies and goes to the underworld, but Orpheus goes on a quest to go to the underworld to bring her back from the dead. And he actually manages to get to the underworld, and he actually manages to get all the way there. And in this moment in the story, what happens is that he actually plays music for Persephone, who is the queen of the underworld, and she is very moved by the beauty of his playing. He was like famously like the best musician in the world. By the beauty of his playing and the sincerity of his love, that she prevails upon Hades to let Eurydice go back up to the land of the living. And so when I do these narratives, I often find that there's a point in the story, and it's that point that I'm interested in. There's the whole story, and you want to, like, it's useful to know the whole story. But for me, it's the way that she is moved by his sincerity, moved by the passion and the commitment to what he's doing. And then that actually then connects to, I find that often the narratives that I'm interested in often have some self-referential aspect to the story. With Pandora, like I had my child right after September 11, so there was a lot of vulnerability and fragility involved in like the feelings around September 11. This story, the theme of this story is about going to the ends of the earth for something you love. And I think that when you are a figurative artist and trying to master a very difficult skill set, trying to make a living in a field that seems very challenging to make large-scale figurative work or figurative work, right? But you see around you these other artists who are so passionately willing to just like be committed to that tradition and do that. So I see kind of a parallel between what he is doing in terms of going to the ends of the earth for beauty and for love, that, you know, that is his story, and I see myself in that story. There's another level, which is that he's playing a kora, which is an African instrument. And the African tradition of kora music is a 700-year-old tradition that is passed down from master to student to master to student, which is exactly how we learn the figurative tradition, from master to student to master to student. And you can trace, you know, our lineage back to the Renaissance. And so I see that as a parallel. So they're thinking about that onion and peeling away the layers of the onion. For me, these stories are ways to weave in a lot of different ideas that I'm interested in. Just a couple close-ups. So the kora is a Western African instrument, and I'm very interested in how, the characters that I use, that I'm not exclusively telling like a white Western European story. So I'm often very intentional about the characters I'm using, and I really liked the classic Greek instrument is a harp. There's nothing kind of quite goofier than like thinking about like a musician playing a harp in a contemporary painting. So I started with that, and I just like this just look dumb. And so when I discovered that kora, I was like, but it's a 21 stringed instrument, an ancient instrument. It's like very similar. This is actually my child, Jocelyn, who posed. She's playing Persephone's daughter, and she has this gold thread because it's also kind of a metaphor for the cutting the thread of life. So there is a lot. I'll often just sprinkle lots of little symbols and details into my work. This drawing is another example of my process that is unlike the other ones that we were just looking at, which I kind of started with a concept sketch and then figured out how to pose the model, get the model. In this case, this is a model I love to work with. Her name is Rachel. And she just took this pose, and I was just like really excited. I was like, it just spoke to me. I was like, I have to make a painting of this pose. And I was actually drawing with some friends, and they were like looking at me like, why? Like, why? You know, they didn't have the same response, you know, to this, but the pose evoked something to me. And I find that is often another way that my process unfolds, is that working with a great model, there's just a process, and something unfolds, and you see an idea. So after she left, I did this later that evening, a color sketch. And just using a few colors, I was probably using a limited palette, and I probably only worked on this for about an hour. And I did it very quickly. And one of the things that I have been doing, and I sort of recommend, is that I actually try to make these color sketches and concept sketches very quickly. I think of it as a way to try to outpace my censor. Because my censor is going to come in and tell me that this is stupid, and you don't know what you're doing, and this seems really hard, and I'm not sure this painting is a good idea. And if I can just work really quickly and get the idea down, then the next day I can look at it and I can say, still like that idea, right? As opposed to only getting halfway in and deciding you don't know what you're doing, right? So as time has gone by, I'm going to show a few later, I'm working much more quickly on these concept sketches, sometimes using watercolor or really limited palette, and doing them quickly. So then maybe it doesn't look like a beautiful finished painting, but that's not what it's for. It's for me to get down a visual idea. And then here's the finished painting, which in some ways is more elaborate, but in other ways is really not any different. Like, I didn't add that much more to this painting from my original concept sketch. I just got a little bit more detailed in the expression of it, obviously spending more time with the modeling. With my figures these days, I draw. I often will set up the painting not from life, but from my drawing, and then do a lot of the underpainting from my drawing, and then have the model come back in and paint again from life. I find that in some ways that process allows my mind to imagine and design and conceive of what I want it to be, as opposed to always working from life and chasing the value structure or the drawing, like to just allow my imagination to do the work, working from my references for a little bit longer, and then get the model back in. I did get some black wings. Actually, my husband Duncan ordered the wings, giant black wings of a crow, because I was complaining about not knowing how to paint wings. So I, literally did have some wings in the studio. I invented the branchy stuff, the sort of metal stuff. I invented the water. I'd go online and look at, you can even look at videos of water crashing on rocks, or looking at slow-mo pictures of water and rocks. So for details like that, I'll find references, look at references, but then often not really paint from the references. I looked at them, and then I'm painting from imagination. One more process. These are very small thumbnail drawings in a sketchbook. They're probably only 2 inches by 2 inches, those little pencil drawings, or 2 by 3. But I had started to have an idea for a painting, thinking about Susanna and the elders. Bathsheba is a theme I've painted before. And then the watercolor is done also from imagination. So I'll often start very small and then work just a little bit bigger. So the watercolor is 4 inches by 5 inches. I find if I try to go too much bigger than that, things fall apart. I don't know what I'm doing and the figure looks weird. But if I can kind of keep it at a smaller scale and work a little bit quickly, that I can at least get an idea down. Then I did a life drawing. So then I went and had the model in. I knew that I wanted to pursue this concept. Now I'll do the life drawing. So I did a careful life drawing. And then here's the finished painting. What I was thinking about with this painting, and the next one that I will show you, is this lighting condition of a moonlight lighting condition. I was using a blue gel and some a blue rim light, and just thinking about, instead of it being, I was thinking about the constancy of color. How do you make it look like it's a skin-toned colored person in a blue light, as opposed to a blue person or a purple person, right? But it's a skin-toned colored person in a blue light. I was very interested in that concept and how you might use color and palette to do that. This one, I probably also did a lot of the underpainting and transfer from my drawing, and then had the model back in and painted from life with that strange lighting condition. But then everything else is invented. The water is invented. Really, the cloth is invented. The sky is invented. This one was in part in preparation for this painting, which was the larger scale version of this theme, Susanna in the Moonlight. I did also actually do a separate drawing of this, but that I'm not showing. The theme of Susanna is, it's a biblical story, and she is spied on in a garden, and she's a virtuous woman, but the men who spy on her then accuse her of lascivious behavior, and she gets taken to court, and she's protesting her innocence, and they were the creepy creepers who looked over the wall. And so this was all basically it's a Me Too painting. So again, there's always some way in which the narrative that I'm thinking about at any given time is resonant to me in a particular time and place. I think sometimes the ways in which they are almost autobiographical, maybe even I figure it out later in retrospect, right? But I'm finding more and more that that's true. So, and also I am a female painter who paints a lot of beautiful nudes. And so in the history of the nude in the 20th century, There was actually, for women artists, a very specific rejection of the beautiful nude as subject matter. I think Cindy Sherman said that the idea of the female nude bores her to tears. But yet here I am, having gone to art school and being told that I should paint what I want to paint, and I really like painting beautiful female nudes. So, but I can never quite escape from that context, right, and that the history of the nude. But then I am a woman, so I am looking at her. She is looking at the dog is looking at the creepy creepers. Actually, it's Picasso, just done from a photo. It's actually, the other guy is this artist, Alexi Steele, who looks a lot like Anthony Van Dyke or like Velázquez, right? And he's just a friend of mine, and he was just like, I'll pose for you. And just representing kind of the male gaze or like the male artist gaze. I think Picasso, like, you know, there's a lot of baggage to unpack there about how he related to women in his subject matter. And then tangential to all of this about who's looking at whom, who is beautiful to whom, is this issue of color, right? And is this a skin-toned person in a blue light, or is it a blue person? And the color that I used on this thing is crazy. Like, I was using like very turquoise blues, and I was using dioxanine purples, and I was using magentas, and like literally what's on your palette, you're like, this is never gonna work, right? But color is relative. And the way you see color in relationship to everything else is relative. One more, again, a drawing of this figure, of this Venus painting that I did. The drawing, especially for the turned up head, I knew that she's so pretty, you know, and I often find that with figurative work, like, I want to do it multiple times. Like, I'm gonna do it once, I'm gonna do it again, I'm gonna do it again, and each time I get a little better at doing it, and I don't necessarily do it right the first time, especially with like portraiture. A pretty, like, I gotta practice. So oftentimes that's part of my process. The work on paper, I'm increasingly interested in how to use paper that still sort of expresses something painterly in pictorial space. So I've been doing more with like watercolor or atmosphere. And then here is the finished painting called The Dance of Life and Death that was done right at the end of 2020. So this is very much like a pandemic-themed painting. And to me, as an artist in the pandemic, I knew that I was greatly privileged to be able to, you know, have my job where I stayed inside my room and made art in a world that often felt, you know, to be on fire in various ways. But then also it kind of confirmed to me that that I am an artist, even in this time, and that the arts are essential even in this time. And if I am going to sort of do what I'm to do in this world and be who I am in this world, I'm still going to paint. And so it's also kind of about the fragility of life and the essentialness of being who we are and finding joy and passion in what we do, no matter what the circumstances. So so that's showing my work and my process, and then I'm going to pivot and talk a little bit about some concepts about world building and skills in terms of things that I think we need to master to do multi-figure narrative and sort of constructive work. I just want to give a nod to my friend Patrick Connors, who is my teacher at New York Academy, Dan's teacher at New York Academy. He was the master perspective teacher to a whole generation of people. And he was an excellent teacher. You can actually take a class. He has a class that's on Craftsy. That's a perspective course, and there's also stuff on YouTube. And I highly recommend, especially that Craftsy class. It's such a good deal, and it's like seven class, really straightforward. So the concepts I was talking about at the beginning in terms of maybe model making or perspective construction, do yourself a favor and do some work in perspective. Patrick was trained at the graduate of the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, and he taught at New York Academy, and he taught at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. and many other places. He really was a teacher to a great number of people in this generation. His own work used a lot of perspective skills, then also a lot of plein air directing, painting from life and observation. I just want to recommend Patrick Connors to you. And there were two key concepts that I think a lot about from Patrick that I want to bring into this conversation. Well, one of them is just great advice for painters, which is what Patrick would always say is painter, paint. Right? Like, if you want to figure it out, if you want to get through it, if you want to figure out what you're doing, painter, paint. Right? There is no other way. And he was such a generous teacher, and that's great advice. He also had this concept called camera-conditioned space. And so the next few things I want to show you is relating to what is camera-conditioned space as opposed to conceptualized space of other forms. And when you looked at the scenic design space or the perspective drawings, all of that is a different kind of pictorial imagined space, and camera-conditioned space is sort of yet another thing. So this artist, I think you had shown here, I don't know if this piece was shown here, but this is Lavallee Miller, who is another artist who's in the Bennett collection. And this is a large-scale portrait, 40 by 30 inches. It's mesmerizing how she makes them. They're actually like many multiple layers of glaze, like on paper. Really just beautiful and emotional images. And this is going to sound like I'm criticizing her work, which is not my intention at all, but I'm using this as an example of this idea of this, to me, is a good example of something that is basically a camera-conditioned space image. Because when we see a person in real life, they don't quite look like this. But when you have a photo, especially taken from close angle, they do. And so there's a lot of ways in which the way we perceive faces, images, is very conditioned by the way we see photography. And I think that as artists, we should be free to use whatever tools we can, and I love the way what she is doing so poetically. But you should also just be very conscious of the choice that you're making and what's happening in those universes. I'm going to show this video clip that I just found online from this great teacher named Parker Walbeck, and he's on Instagram at Full-Time Filmmaker. And this video is showing how different focal lengths affect the human face. Not everyone is going to shoot at 16 millimeters from 20 feet away and crop their image in 200%. So I'm going to play this video and let you watch it. Hopefully, I'm going to do this right. So if that didn't blow your mind, that blew my mind. And from the point of view of a portrait artist, it makes you realize, what does she even look like? Right? What does she even look like? And if you're trying to make a likeness of someone, you're like, well, okay, no. All right? So that's just a really clear example of how photo camera conditioned space, focal length, conceptualization, and that we as artists have to basically be masters of this, and you have to make a choice about what focal length do you want, right? I think it's in Leonardo, right? He talks about that the ideal distance to paint a human person is or 3 times so basically 18 feet, right? And that you get very little, your cone of vision is very long. So from the top of the head to the bottom of the feet, you get a lot less distortion. The closer you get to the model, you look up at the head, you look down at the feet, right? And in terms of pictorial construction, that's really important thing to consider. So what has happened in the contemporary world is that we see the photo as a document, right? That the photo is a fact, And there's a book by Daniel Boorstin, The Image, A Guide to Pseudo Events in America, and it's a little bit nerdy, but it's fantastic, and it's actually not that hard to read. But it talks a lot about how the graphic revolution, the proliferations of photography, has fundamentally changed the way we see and the way we see the world. And I think now that we're with Instagram and Facebook, it's all happening again on a whole nother level, right? So now the photo is sort of fact. And thinking about that Lavalley Miller, right? That is such a feeling of today's face. I once actually had an interview with somebody who was at the National Portrait Gallery, and she was talking about the Utwin Buchiever Prize. She was like, what we're looking for is people who paint portraits of people with today's face, right? Like, well, what does that mean, right? But I think what she meant, she's not a painter, she's a curator, right? I think what she meant is this idea of the camera conditioned space, which is what we've come to think of if you think about maybe an artist like Diane Arbus or the photographer Avignon, right? That's today's face, right? But those are photos, Mapplethorpe, today's face. And whether we intend it or not, we often take that the photo is a fact, is truth, and accept it as such. This is Martha Erlbacher, and it's a kind of just exactly the opposite of the photo-conditioned space. She was always working from observation. She was an American painter. She was based here in Philadelphia. And she was my professor at New York Academy, and significantly, she was my only female teacher. And she was very interested in construction and narrative. This is a work of hers called Youth. And her key teaching concepts were this idea of form sense and willed form, so that you as an artist are the person constructing the form and the lighting, and as opposed to then sort of taking it, receiving it from the photo, that you're generating the form. And then she really taught about this concept of world building. And so the rest of this, and I'm going to try and go a little bit quicker because I want to be mindful of everybody's time. She was really interested in archetypes and myths, and she explored what it means to be alive, right, through her paintings. She also taught that basically the only themes in any painting were sex and death. It's a still life, it's about death. It's a nude, it's about sex, right? And it's simplistic, but it's also in some ways funny and true. And here's a couple other images of hers. And so, in the reclining nude, and again, it's this, she was working from life, working from observation, but then creating these images that felt very mythic and otherworldly, right? An invented world. So in the 19th century, a lot of this kind of world building was rejected by modernism, and Manet, there was an essay by Baudelaire, The Painters of Modern Life, and he was a great friend and colleague of Manet. And they were like, all of this myth-building narrative, it's just silliness, right? And we should paint the world around us and what we see and what we experience. And what we see and experience is also beautiful and valid and true and epic. And all of those things can be completely true, right? So they became painters of modern life. But where we are now is that if you're interested in world building, then are you making a world that is fiction or nonfiction, right? With Manet, it was about we should be painters of modern life. It was nonfiction. Look around you in the real world, and it's full of amazing, beautiful things to paint. But then in world building, if you are interested in fiction, you have to grapple with the issue of the willing suspension of disbelief. And this is another concept that goes back to theater or literature. If you're building a work of fiction or a work of theater, you have to get everyone in the audience to believe that the angel can fly across the stage, or whatever magical thing is happening. You have to construct the universe so that the audience accepts what's happening as true. And I think that this is actually kind of a point where contemporary figurative work is facing challenge because of the way that we internalize sort of the realism of objects around us, and then how do we get people to accept that maybe this world that we're building is it's not document, it's a work of fiction and a work of invention. And so can you come into my world, and then what happens within that world? So there are a lot of artists, Michael Grimaldi, who presented here. Like, I kind of see this as more like a work of nonfiction, right? Perception. It's like materialistically connected to our real world. This is Elisa Monk's, and it is also sort of a work of nonfiction. She's very interested in abstraction, texture, expressiveness, handling. But it also is like, well, where do we find nudes in contemporary society? Well, we find them in bathtubs. It's a very naturalist place, realistic place to find the nude. So it's also sort of a work of nonfiction in its own way. Whereas, of course, Ad Nerdrum is creating a world of fiction. And it's sort of this dystopian, like post-apocalyptic, and people walk around naked with shields, and they make tools out of like twine, right? But within his universe, all of those things are coherent. So I just am inviting you to think about how that, if you're when constructing an image, how do you create a little universe, even if it's just 2 foot by 3 foot, right? That has its own rules that are acceptable. Why is that naked person sitting on a rock? How do you get a modern audience to accept that? This is Anthony Baus, and it's an interesting tension between fiction and nonfiction. It sort of feels like fiction, but he's also using these contemporary elements. Bo Bartlett, I think, is very much kind of he's building a world that is parallel to ours. It's not a magical world. It seems to be bound very much in the same light and air and rules of gravity and mortality that we have here in this real world. But his pictorial space has a certain light and atmosphere, the coloration, right? And it is its own coherent, internal pictorial world that is close to our world, but it is not quite realism either. A sketch, a drawing, so you can just see a little bit of it about his process. Small sketch on paper. He does a lot of sketches, a lot of drawings preparatory to his work. And then a large-scale painting. I'm going to go, this is Haesun's Song, working in a much more abstracted, looser way than some of the other ones we're working on, but still very much building this cohesive sense of pictorial space and atmosphere. These are 3 sketches that she used, concept sketches, to develop a large-scale piece. That one in the upper corner is very quick. She's like, yeah, I think I did that in about 30, 40 minutes. So again, that technique of when you're trying to start to develop these things, that it often is very helpful to work pretty quickly in the early stages, to just get the idea out rather than get bogged down in the fact that you don't know what you're doing. I also kind of like to try to work intuitively and quickly in those early stages. And then this is the large-scale piece. This is also 8 feet by 10 feet, very big. And a lot of painterly and abstracted qualities. This is Adam Miller, very Baroque and Mannerist in his conception, but thinking about that theatrical design, right? There's sort of a backdrop. There's set elements. He uses a lot of photo in his work, so he might be doing a little less of finding them. He's probably getting the cans and putting them in his still life, in his studio. But he's often with the figures, sometimes working with photo reference and sometimes working from life. But constructing, breaking down the problem one piece at a time and constructing the image. Noah Buchanan, these are his preparatory drawings for the allegory commission for the library doors. That's at the Salmagundi Club. And so these he's doing much more from life, and you can see the rigor with which he's focusing on each little detail that he's going to put into his painting and the specificness of the gesture, the face. Going to really analyzing each little thing very carefully. But then here is, excuse me, I think this is the sketch, and I think I don't also have the finished piece. But you see now he's using a lot of imaginative construction to assemble all of the details, right? That he's doing the studies from life, the drawing the life. But then obviously everything else is getting stuck together. You remember I talked about how like background, foreground, and then the tricky part is the transitions between them. Notice how, what comes in front and what goes behind, and where there's a piece of drapery or a pile of books or a hand or something that helps you move through, but also kind of helps, explain or put this is in front and that's behind. So, incredible attention to detail in terms of how to take all of these elements, a lot of which is painted from life, some of which is found and, painted from imagination, but how each element adds up into a whole image. This is one other example of an artist, how they're making things. This is a model, a paper model that this artist made they wanted to make an invented room. And so they made this small paper model, Anna Wykich model for the withdrawing room. And then on the lower image, you see that they they did all the painting on the little paper model and then lit it so that they would have this lighting condition, right, to observe, but at a very small scale. And then this is the painting, which if you can wrap your mind around this, it's actually not a flat painting. It's actually painted on the inside of a hemisphere. So it actually also kind of visually heightens this illusion of this space that you can look into. So this painting, The Withdrawing Room. But as soon as I saw that model making thing she was doing, I was just like, what a great idea. How do you solve these problems? Skill building, as we wrap up. So what are some of the components of skill building that you want to have to be able to do things like this? Perspective, as we talked about. Structural drawing, and I think that you guys actually are doing some of that here, whether you're looking at, whether it's casts or platonic solids, how are you drawing and making sure, can you draw the cube so that it looks like a cube in space? Can you rotate it around in space? Stereometric figure drawing, which I'm going to show you. Furniture, propping, costumes, staging, casting, finding your model, clothing, all of those are specific details, right? And the better you do each one of those specific details, the better the whole is going to be. Thinking about lighting design, what is the impact of a dramatic chiaroscuro, tenebrous lighting as opposed to, Renoir, right? All of those are choices. Photography, and I'm more and more, especially with the pandemic, frankly, using more photography in my process, and I'm always interested in these poses that are not really poses that a model can hold. So even if I'm having the model in to work with, I'm also using photo to help bridge the gap between a pose that is difficult or I need a little more information. And the better you make your references, the more complete you make your references with the lighting, the propping, the details, the better your painting is going to be. And then lastly, learning to do concept sketches from your imagination. And even if that seems really scary at first, to just do it and to do it, and to make a mess and bumble it, because no one can do, you have to do that by yourself in your room, and no one can do it for you. But if you just kind of boldly, I'm just going to, small scale, it's really important. So stereometric figure construction, You're probably doing some of this to understand the rib cage, the torso, the head in these various planes, so that can you figure out how to mentally rotate it, light it. So having a concept of this, and frankly, in your back pocket, you should know that the rib cage is is a head and a half, and the width is 3/4, and the pelvis is a head. You should know those things. So this one is a lot like that. There's a classic Luca Cambiaso, right? How then would you start to make figures in space and move them in space? This is a composition for No-10 thumbnail studies. So in thinking about composition, right, starting with No-10 and really small scale, these are just like this, literally the size of a credit card. How do you start to think about composition on a really small scale using just black and white and really high contrast? How clearly can you tell a story just with simple shapes of black and white? This is some student work from the Aristides Atelier by an artist named Tanya Kramarenko. And it's just a really great example of that like simple value study, No-tan, a little bit more complex than the one you just saw, but she's working in like 4 values of gray paper. And if you can make a composition that tells a story well in such a reduced set of shape and value, that's going to be a really valuable skill for building pictures. This is a simple model making exercise that just it's called a paper playground, where you just make folded paper and glue and a model and kind of make it in space and then make a drawing from that. And it's just a simple construction exercise of how to start to build volumes in space. So it's a great conceptualization tool, and also just very simple model making. You could start to imagine, well, what if you put a sky behind it, or what if you added this? So then this is like these are actually exercises from my book, and so this is a very simple drawing from that model, starting to think about pictorial construction. These are some small thumbnail sketches. These are mostly like 4 by 6 inches, some smaller, a little bigger. So an example of it, all from imagination. I'm using watercolor and paper because I find watercolor goes very quickly, and I can also kind of do them really quickly without, again, without my sensor getting in the way. Just sort of like, there's something about working on paper that I'm like, I'm not doing anything very serious here. I'm just sort of playing around. And then lastly, but I have a book coming out. A lot of these exercises that I shared at the end are shared in that book called The Path of Drawing, and it's about how we use creativity and drawing as a practice of mindfulness to help develop our individual voice, or give time and space in our creative practice for our own thoughts or ideas about what we want, what we're interested in, what subjects connect with us, how do we use drawing as a practice and creativity as a practice to develop our voice. So thank you so much for your time, and I'm going to open it up to questions.
Patty, let me be the first to say how illuminating and awesome that was to hear you speak. I want to encourage questions from the blogosphere and the internet space. So if anybody has a question in person, I just ask that you repeat your question into the mic before you ask Patty. Does anybody have a question?
Hello, can you hear me clearly on the cool? Wow, that was awesome. I loved looking at the sketches and the process of the paintings, and I wanted to know, when you draw and sketch the figure, do you think about different things depending on the material that you work with? Let's say you're doing a 2-inch by 2-inch graphite versus a 5-inch by 3-inch watercolor, and then graphite and white chalk, and then red chalk.
Mm-hmm. So I do, and I find that thinking in color and shape seems to come more naturally to me. And so I have found that actually in sketching that I've kind of switched to watercolor or oil sketch, and because I find it actually goes more quickly and it's easier for me to think in blocks and shapes of color and value. Whereas actually drawing, then I tend to slow down, and then I want to draw it right, or I want to draw it well, and actually then it becomes linear. And so the drawing for me, I tend to more use that as a vehicle to figure out, well, what is this pose, or what does that hand look like, or what is the portrait, when I need to research the details. But for concept sketches, I find that it's much easier for me to work in color, and to actually, often with not a lot of drawing, with a very cursory drawing. Yeah.
In these concept sketches that you were talking about, there were some questions about your material handling and your paper, what you've been doing with your toning and treatment of that sort. Could you speak on that, please?
So my concept sketches, some of them are actually just done on a mixed media sketchbook. So it's a thick paper, but it's a white paper. And so some of them are just on white and using, like I said, more watercolor. Or I will tone the paper with watercolor and then draw onto it and add white to pull out the lights. I do a lot of drawing also on watercolor paper that's toned, and then, you know, adding graphite, adding white. But I also will work, I like working on paper, and I sometimes will work on paper that's been prepared with an imprimatura that maybe, it varies, I'll mix it up. Sometimes it's kind of a light gray. Actually, like I also was very influenced by Nelson Shanks, and he uses that kind of light buff tan. So my imprimatura, that's often a color I will use. But, or sometimes actually pink, and that is kind of thanks to Martha Erlbacher. She was always into Venetian red. So working on paper that has a tone, sometimes white, especially if you're sketching on oil. I don't like to sketch on oil, with oil on white paper. That's nice for watercolor, but on oil sketches on paper, I tend to work on imprimatura.
Great. I love what you said about Martha, and also your reference to readability made me think of her favorite book that she used to preach on and on about, which was Art and Visual Perception.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
There's a lot of well-deserved love coming through the internet space. Not too many questions. Does anybody have a question in the room? Anybody else?
Okay.
Yeah, Brooks, hold on a second. Go under the camera.
Hi. So great seeing your, especially your earlier work. I was wondering, with the theater, I was wondering, like, if you had any hopes for the future of allegorical figurative painting, like, just not just you, but if it's such an interesting space.
So I do have a lot of hopes for that, because I am actually increasingly interested in imaginative works. And I think that when I was coming up as a young painter, in the environment that I was in, all of the, you know, like in New York School, Bert Silverman, Dinnerstein, like they might have been doing large-scale figurative work, but it was very much observational and about the real world. And actually even the idea of doing like a myth or a narrative, when I was beginning, it almost seemed silly. It almost seemed, you know, inappropriate. But like, you know, they wouldn't be taken seriously. But I find that as time has gone by, as more and more people are making figurative work of all different types, that I'm actually increasingly interested in work that is involving world building, you know, and is like when you look at an odd Nerdrum and you're sort of like, as Martha would say, in Nerdrum land, or you're in Rubens land, right? Or Bo Bartlett, right? I'm interested in that world and what that artist and what it says, to not just see one painting from an artist, but to see a whole body of work that's kind of showing you, you know, what the world, because it really ultimately, it's coming from the artist's mind, right? And if we're communicating what the things that are invented from my mind, and then I get to communicate with you about what's invented in your mind, that seems like access to a conversation that is really interesting. You know, no one in the world can express the images that are in your mind except you, right? It's a vast interior landscape that can be explored, but you're the only one who can explore it. And I find that idea increasingly very interesting. And honestly, also, if you just think about how do we solve problems in the world, how do we make the world become something different than what it is today, right? Every change, every transformation in society is the result of a visualization, a conceptualization of an idea. And visual artists, right, we have a skill or a talent, hopefully, for manifesting a visualization to share with the world that then maybe has the power to change the way the world imagines or sees what is possible. So I think that we should be working more from imagination because I think it has the capacity to transform maybe what we might be capable of imagining.
Thank you.
I think, Patty, that's a fantastic way to end it. That was just fabulous. Thank you so much for being here and sharing
Great
your
to be here.
incredible perspective with us. And thank you all for being here online. And we'll see you at the next lecture. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, Dan.